Welcome to Module 30 on Feedforward neural networks. By the end of this module, you should be able to explain what a feedforward neural network is as a composition of linear mappings and nonlinear activations. You'll be able to write down mathematically a simple multi-layer perceptron and track the shapes of its parameters, just identify its parameters and describe them. You'll be able to compare the capacity of logistic regression versus shallow and, deeper networks using parameter counts and decision boundaries. You'll be able to implement a very simple feedforward neural network classifier in Python, basically in scikit-learn, although I'll point to some PyTorch libraries at the end. And we're going to use some toy data sets today. And also you'll be able to diagnose basic under or overfitting patterns in feedforward neural networks, or at least to think about them if they're not obvious in the models. So just a quick recap of linear models. We've talked about these quite a bit. We have a model f of x, calling it linear, f sub linear. And we have a d-dimensional input x. In order to make a prediction, we just multiply that vector by a weight vector, w. There's just this transpose of it. We have some bias term, and that's basically it. And we learn such a model by updating w and b according to some loss function or some kind of empirical risk. When we're doing classification, usually what we want is something like, here's a simple transformation. We have the linear model, which is passed into a sigmoid, indicated by this sigma. And this is going to be on this order of 0 to 1. And it'll basically tell us the probability of a class y being 1, in category 1, given the input. And over here is just the definition. This is our familiar sigmoid function. So the decision boundary has been, at least initially, a hyperplane, a straight kind of plane through multidimensional space. This is great when classes are approximately linearly separable, but if you have, curved boundaries or little pockets of classes in the wrong spot, so to speak, this can be complicated. So we want flexible functions, and we want to represent nonlinear decision boundaries, which is very common in the real world. We talked a lot about how to work in nonlinear spaces. So modules 19 to 21 introduced us to kernel methods to get nonlinear boundaries within models that are otherwise sort of linear. But what we'd like to do now is maybe take a function that can learn nonlinear relationships in the data by basically stacking together lots and lots of very simple transformations, ideally nonlinear ones, layer by layer. And what I mean by layer is you probably already know, but we'll get to that in a second. Every layer is going to have a linear map, and then there's going to be a linear activation function through which this linear map goes through. You can see from the previous slide right here that this is very similar to what we've been doing with good old-fashioned logistic regression. We have a linear function, and that linear function is passed through a nonlinear function, a nonlinear transformation. That's all we're going to be doing again with these neural networks. But if we stack a lot of these things on top of each other, we ought to be able to get a very rich family of functions. So, back in the early days of machine learning, of modern machine learning, let's say going back to the 1990s, the 2000s, and the 2010s, there was lots of different camps of different groups that were working on machine learning, and one camp of many was focused on neural networks. And the general idea is, we already have machines that move around in the real world and can learn from the real world. Those are biological machines, and like animals, including humans. And the way that humans learn is entirely representable within the brains of the humans, which is just basically composed of neurons and connections between neurons. So just very quickly, the inspiration comes from biology. This is a picture of a cell. This comes from Wikipedia. So a cell like this one will receive electrical signals on dendrites, these sort of branches that lead into, roots that lead into the cell body, which contains a soma. So if all these electrical signals along all of these dendrites this is very simple right now. This is not a biology class, but the idea is if the electrical signal surpasses some pre-existing threshold in that particular cell, then that cell will fire an action potential down an axon. This is like another branch to other neurons. There's going to be connections between one neuron and the other through these things called synapses. And I mean, people are still, learning how the brain works. This is not a solved problem by any means, but generally, it can be, from a certain point of view, said that everything that we are, every memory, how we learn, our personalities, are entirely encoded through millions and millions of connections. Each of these synapses are composed of a number of different neurotransmitters in different amounts, and if you increase or decrease these neurotransmitters, you get different amounts of electrical signal passing from one cell to the other. So just like tweaking the amount of neurotransmitters on these synaptic connections, changing the what it takes to make the soma fire, given all of these inputs on the dendrite. There's also some noise. So like you might have heard of like omegas, like eating seafood is good because it increases the score of myelin sheath along this axon. If that sheath degrades, then the signal is sort of changed, and then the overall behavior of the animal or human is also degraded. I mean, I'm getting into too many details here, but you can see how this is a kind of a very simple machine. It takes a lot of inputs. It sums them together, passes them through a simple function, and then that function will fire. And then the degree to which that firing affects other simple machines to which it's connected is as a matter of scaling or weighting an amount of neurotransmitters on these synaptic connections. So this is fairly easy. What I just described a moment ago is fairly easy to describe mathematically. A lot of discussion around neural networks act as if it was something that was invented in the past like 5 or 6 years, but the core idea, which still exists fundamentally today, goes all the way back to the early 1940s in this famous paper by McCulloch and Pitts. The idea is we have this simple machine indicated here on the right. There is a feature vector of inputs called A sub 1, A sub 2, all the way up to A sub m. In this graph, m is 3. There are parameter weights called W, one for each input. So W sub 1, W sub 2, all the way up to W sub m. In this graph, there's 3 of them, m equals 3. And then maybe there's this bias term also over here, which is not indicated, but W sub 0 would be the bias term, very similar to what we saw in regression and logistic regression earlier. So these A's are sort of like the activations from other neurons coming into this neuron over here, and these weights are a very simple representation of the amounts of certain neurotransmitters that connect the two neurons together. You can just multiply like each weight by its corresponding activation, sum them together, add the bias term, and you get an input x to this artificial neuron. That value x, the sum of the weighted activations, will be passed through a function g. This is like the soma now, and then it'll produce a output s. Okay, here the function is g, right? We'll see a bunch of different examples of what g can be in a moment. But that's basically it. So this is like a very simple mathematical representation of what we just described in terms of the biology of animal neurons. Even back in the early days of neural networks, it was shown that even this simple representation can implement simple Boolean logic. I'll come back to this in a moment too. So if you want to do classification just with a single neuron, well, you can interpret X, like the weighted combination of all the activations, as just a score for class 1 or class 0, and then you can have the step function shown here and represented here on the left. So the prediction is class 1 if x is above some threshold. In this case, the threshold is 0. And otherwise, if x is below that threshold, then it's class 0, right? So this is g is this nonlinear step function, and it just produces a prediction class 1 or class 0. So we're doing classification even with a simple artificial neural network. I should mention also that, just like I kind of mentioned, that like learning can happen in terms of like the behavior of an individual neuron's like propensity for firing. Similarly, you can move this threshold up and down. You can fire if x is only greater or equal to 1 or 2. So you can also technically tweak that aspect of the model. This is not differentiable. You'll remember from the earlier discussions about these gradient-based methods that we like functions to be differentiable, and we're going to come back to differentiable functions, not a little bit today, but mostly in subsequent modules. So geometrically, in the space of m-dimensional real-valued numbers, remember m is just the size of the inputs, like the cardinality of the inputs. This perceptron is a linear classifier, and the decision boundary is this hyperplane defined by the same old traditional function. But we can replace the step function with all kinds of other functions g. If we want to do gradient-based learning, and we will, we want g to be differentiable, and so all kinds of smooth functions that are differentiable became popular. There's, of course, a sigmoid function, which we talked about before, shown here in orange. And then there's a hyperbolic tangent, shown here in green. It's very similar in shape to the sigmoid. By default, it'll squash the inputs to it'll squash the outputs to -1 to 1. So given any value of x, it'll produce one of those between those extremes. So this nonlinear function g, being a sigmoid or tanh h for the moment, is actually going to be essential. We're going to see why in a second, because without this nonlinearity, any kind of combination of one neural network one neuron after another will just collapse into simple linear functions, and we'll never be able to learn anything nonlinear, which is what we're trying to do in the first case. Smooth G functions, like this one, enables this gradient-based methods, like I mentioned earlier, and we're going to see a little bit later a backpropagation, but not really in this module. It'll come later. Rectified linear units, or ReLUs, and soft plus. Whoa, so eager to learn everything. I jumped to the very end. Somehow. I think I might have clicked on this link by accident. So there's two other nonlinear functions that are very common in modern neural networks. One, rectified linear units, goes to this group, including Yoshua Bengio, way back to 2011. And it became very popular. This is just the function here shown in blue, which is a max of 0 or x, right? So if the input x, the weighted combination, is less than 0, just output 0. And if it's anything above 0 or equal to 0, in either case, it'll just produce x. So that became very popular. It's, let's say why in a second. There's a smooth cousin, I guess you can call it, called soft plus, which is shown here in orange, which is just the log of 1 plus e to the x. It approximates ReLU pretty nicely, but it's totally smooth and easily differentiable. So why would we choose ReLU instead of sigmoid or tanh h? Well, ReLU is piecewise linear. So if it's piecewise linear, so less than 0, greater than 0, super easy to compute. These ReLU functions avoid saturations for large positive values of x. So gradients don't vanish for very large values of x. And I guess more practically, they encourage sparse activations. So if many, if the x tends to be less than some threshold, in this case it's going to be plain 0, then the outputs are going to be 0. That's kind of functionally turning off that neuron in terms of its effect downstream. And this is kind of like we talked about, is similar to regularization. We're going to see regularization, which explicitly turns off neurons in a future module. And doing this helps with efficiency, and it helps with representation, and it helps with regularization. So ReLUs became popular for those reasons. I should mention, kind of one of the core systems administrators in the AI group in Toronto, where Jeff Hinton worked, was also called ReLU. I never found out if that's a coincidence or not. I mean, obviously Bengio is in Montreal, not Toronto, but it's at least a funny coincidence. So going back again to the distant past, this paper by Frank Rosenblatt in 1958. How do you learn a single perceptron? You'll have training data, like always. In this case, you're going to have activations. Like this is like the inputs you have initially. You have the class or the outputs you're trying to produce. In this case, it is classification. Y is either 0 or 1. We're doing simple binary classification. And the prediction is basically just going to be 1 if the linear function, again, so right now G is just like a unit, like it's just literally the weighted combination. This is X, as you remember. If X is greater than or equal to 0, output 1. If it's less than 0, output class 0. So this is the step function. So that's the same prediction. Now, the single classic perceptron learning rule is similar to something we're going to see a lot of, but it's a little bit different also. So we still want to assign blame to in the individual inputs. Like if you get a mistake, it must be caused. The only thing you can change really is the weights that modify the inputs. So we need to change those weights. And we start initially with the weight of the input of the neuron. Then we change it according to the difference between what we wanted to see and what we actually predicted. So if y was 1 and we predict 0, this difference will be 1. And then we multiply that by whatever the activation is. Eta is just the learning rate. So this is a hyperparameter that we can tune by hand, and we know how to do that in a motivated way. And we just update. We add this change to whatever the weight was initially. This is a little bit crude, and we're going to see a better version of this general structure fairly soon. But you can see what's going on. There's an error being made. The error is to some extent caused by a particular activation, or the distribution of the activations. So figure out what the error is, multiply it by the activations that caused the error, modulate it a little bit with this learning rate, and update your weights accordingly. And then you do this over and over again. We will see a backpropagation learning rule, which is like the preferred sort of entryway to learning how neural networks learn. But I want to just go back and kind of describe like the fundamental building blocks first. So the idea here is if the perceptron misclassifies a point, you're just going to nudge W a little bit so that the point moves towards the correct side of the decision boundary. If the data is linearly separable, then you can actually go ahead and prove that this algorithm will converge to a separating hyperplane in a finite number of steps. There's lots of links online that you can do that. This is not really, I'm not asking you to do this, but if you really have the time and inclination, you can go ahead and come up with that proof yourself. There are lots of alternatives to this kind of learning rule. So around the same time, like in the 40s and the 50s, so Donald Hebb kind of introduced the idea, which came to be known as associative learning, which isn't so much about updating weights according to this error function, this error signal, but the idea that if two cells are connected and one fires, then the other one is more likely to fire also, and if one doesn't fire, then its neighbor is likely not to fire. So you'd update weights basically based like connections between neurons, just based on like how often they fire together, which results in different behavior. And we're probably going to come back a little bit later in a future module to what we call associative learning, which has different pros and cons than backpropagation learning does. But it's also interesting because just like some of this early work, it was heavily inspired by biology. There's some biological plausibility that this is how, at least part of how humans and other animals learn. Now, like things proceeded slowly. AI was still in its infancy in the 40s and 50s. And in the 60s, and at the end of the 1960s, Marvin Minsky and Seymour Papert wrote this paper that showed that these neural networks had this fundamental limitation. If every single perceptron was essentially a linear classifier, then even with some nonlinearities, or the early types I mentioned earlier, it wouldn't be able to represent any decision boundary that were not linearly separable. So the classic counterexample is exclusive OR. So the way that exclusive OR works is you have two inputs. So you have like two inputs to the neuron, activation 1, activation 2. And these, assume now they're going to be binary, 0 or 1. So we're trying to learn a binary like logical function. Okay. So here they're shown here. This is the activation A. 1 can be 0 or 1. Activations A2 can be 0 or 1. If you want to learn the function and, then that's not this graph over here, but then the outputs would be 0 in all of these possible configurations, except the output will be 1 if both A1 was 1 and A2 was 1, right? So it would be all 0 except the 1 over here. And as you could tell, you can draw a straight line separating that 1 from all of the zeros. Okay. Similarly, if you wanted to learn the OR function, the plain old OR, you'd want to output 1 if either A1 or A2 or both were 1. So in that case, all of these three possible combinations up here, in the upper left, in the upper right, and in the lower right, those would all be 1, and it would be a 0 down here. And again, you can draw a hyperplane a little bit closer to the origin. That would separate the zeros on one side from ones on the other. But the XOR, which is shown here, there's no single line you can draw through this space that would separate like the ones here from the zeros here. We've already kind of seen like a method that would be able to transform this space into a space in which you might be able to slice the zeros from the ones, absolutely. And you already know what that is, so I don't need to mention it again, but it was in a fairly recent module. But at the time anyway, in the 60s, I mean, people were going to Woodstock and Altamont and those kinds of places. They were busy with all kinds of other challenges. They weren't able to glean that very simple step. So this simple kind of counterexample of the capacity of a perceptron individually kind of shut down the field of neural networks as a miniature science for quite a while. Now, this did set up, another solution, which was, well, you could actually solve this problem by adding a series of perceptrons one after the other, and then if they have nonlinearities at every level, then you could learn arbitrary functions, including things like exclusive OR. So they just didn't. Minsky and Papert didn't make that leap in the 1960s. So this is knowing that you could stack perceptrons on top of each other is the jump from single layer perceptrons to multi-layer neural networks, such as this one. So welcome to Feedforward Neural Networks, or FNNs, the main purpose of today's lecture. The mental picture is you still have this input vector. Now we're calling it X. Before I called it A, but there's activations all over this multi-layer neural network. We're calling the inputs X. There are several hidden layers. This is the key. So hidden layer 1, hidden layer 2, and then we have an output layer, which makes a prediction y hat. This is going to be something like logits. So you might have, if you're trying to do classification, you might have just a binary classification, in which case you might have one neuron and you care about whether it's up at 1 or down to 0. Otherwise, you might, if you have, C possible classes, you might have C outputs. And you'd represent them as a one-hot vector when you're training. So if the output should be class 3, then all of the outputs will be 0 except for the third neuron, which will set to 1, or you'll want it to be 1 anyway. These can be thought of as sort of probabilities of those classes. So like, what is the probability that it's class 1? That's whatever, whatever the first neuron on the output layer outputs on the scale of 0 to 1. Similar for the second, third, fourth, and fifth. I should mention that when you're pushing the numbers to the neural network this way, there's no guarantee that the sum of the activations coming out of the output layer all sum to 1. So it's not exactly a probability, but we're going to see later on how to represent an output of all kinds of 0 to 1 numbers as if it is a probability. But by default, each of the outputs is on a scale of 0 to 1. They're pseudo-probabilistic, I guess you could say, and we call those logits. The key thing is the hidden layer, though. Like, we know what the input is when we're learning, so we could actually have the inputs X. If you're doing supervised learning, you also know what the outputs Y are supposed to be, so you can compare the prediction Y hat against the actual output Y. But then you have all these other neurons here in the middle, which we don't know. We have no labels for them. We already talked a lot about, we'll talk to some extent about hidden variables and latent dimensions. And that's essentially what hidden layers 1 and 2 are going to be. We're not going to specify what they are. We're going to push information forward through the neural network according to the same feed-forward rules we saw previously with a single perceptron. The outputs of one artificial neuron will become the activations of the next one. And that's going to be essentially it. And then we're going to push errors back through the network like we saw with a single neuron. It's going to be a bit more complicated than it was before, but not too much more complicated. So we're still going to basically be doing the same sort of thing, and we'll be adjusting the weights as we go, just like we saw with a single neuron. So far so good, and so far it's pretty simple. I'm going to mention very quickly here, we're going to see this again later today, that it's still not exactly understood theoretically, like how, like what these hidden layers are going to learn. There's an awful lot of empirical evidence that suggests that the more hidden layers you add, the more sort of hierarchical structure you can learn in a neural network. And we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit towards like computer vision based neural networks that recognize faces. But you might have seen examples, and we will see an example when we get to convolutional neural networks, of like lower layers, like lower hidden layers like this one over here, hidden layer 1, encoding very low level pixel level information like color, edges, maybe some texture. And as you go deeper and deeper into the neural network, into hidden layers 2, 3, and 4, and so on, you'll see more higher level meaningful structure. So those lines and colors become parts of anatomical features like noses and eyes. Then in the next layer, those noses and eyes are combined in certain ways that are reasonable, and as you get further and further into the neural network, you might have whole identities of whole people. That's speaking very abstractly, which is unfortunately how a lot of papers that do this kind of work represent this sort of empirical finding. But it is a strong empirical finding, and it's something that seems to have some validity to it. So just a little bit of mathematical depth here. We have this L layer feedforward net. Big L is just the number of hidden layers you have. So here we have L equals 2. So for an individual input X, which has a dimensionality d sub 0, again, each of these dimensionalities can be different. Here d sub 0 is equal to 4, d sub 1 is equal to 5, d sub 2 is equal to 3, and so on. All right, so each of these layer sizes can be different, and we can change them. These are all hyperparameters also. D sub L will be the output dimension. So if we have, here's L is 4, the fourth layer is 1. So D sub L is 1. We will have an awful lot of parameters. So for an individual layer script L, which will be somewhere between 1 and big L, we'll have a weight matrix, which is going to be D sub L times D sub L minus 1. I could have drawn this here, but if you look at this graph for a moment, and consider the adjacency matrix between the small bipartite graph formed by the input layer and the hidden layer 1, you can see that there's a connection between x1 and each of the hidden layers in hidden layer 1. Is a connection between x2 and each of the hidden layers in hidden layer 1, and so on. This can be represented by a matrix where element ij basically refers to a connection between input layer I and hidden layer j. That's the weight in that particular element of this weight matrix, which is just how we're going to represent this graph of connections. You know that you can make a graph into an adjacency matrix, so I don't need to belabor this point. But yeah, the connection between the layer L minus 1 and the current layer L is just this weight matrix. And because we might have these biases, you also have a bias matrix of size L. Each of these hidden layers in the Lth layer might have a bias term, which we called B sub 0 before. And this is a bias vector. So if we have, if like the 0th kind of pseudo hidden layer is X, then we have a pre-activation, which is, again, just a linear combination of all of the inputs from the previous layer multiplied by the weights. And the inputs here are like activations from the previous layer, or what we obtained from the previous layer, plus the bias term. This gives us what is Z sub L. This is very similar to what we previously called X. This is a linear combination of the activations and the weights that are applied to them. Then we can take Z sub L and pass it through a nonlinear function. So again, Z sub L was previously called X. We had a nonlinear function G. We might have a different nonlinear function at every hidden layer. Normally you don't have all kinds of random nonlinear functions. Usually you're pretty consistent across at least layers. So imagine G sub L is the ReLU function. And then that's it. And then the network is going to compute the overall function of X. So the prediction here at the very end is going to be just the last hidden layer's value. Okay, so x is a vector of individual numbers clamped here on the inputs, and pushing everything through this neural network will produce, in this case, a single number, y hat, which is the prediction f of x. This whole neural network model is a function. So as I mentioned earlier, G sub L is usually nonlinear. ReLU is very popular, but they could be tanh or sigmoid. Sometimes the last layer might be a linear layer, and we'll see examples of this a little bit later. A little bit more depth. Again, this is something that you probably don't need to study. But this is more or less a proof that if you just compose a lot of linear layers, you're going to end up with a linear function. And this comes back to the claim I made earlier, which is that the nonlinear transformations that you have at every layer or every neuron is important to get nonlinear functions in the end, for f of x to be nonlinear. So imagine you have this is all kind of trivial, I'm going to kind of jump over things quickly. You have a neural network with several layers. The first hidden layer is a linear combination of the input x times the weight matrix between x and the current layer plus some bias term. That's going to output like a bunch of outputs from the first hidden layer. These hidden layers will be passed to the second hidden layer. You'll multiply those first hidden layer outputs by the second weight matrix, add the bias term. This gives us the outputs of the second hidden layer, and so on and so on and so on, all the way down through the network. So here, there's no nonlinearities. G is literally just the identity function, right? So G of x equals x, okay? So that means that the hidden layer at the end will be like w sub f times x plus b sub f, just a linear function. The hidden layer will be a linear function of x. Okay, so, and then this avoids what this fails to achieve what we wanted to use neural networks for in the first place, which is to get over the constraints of linear models that don't use a special trick that I mentioned earlier. So for this is true for some effective weight matrix. So this isn't like an actual weight matrix in the neural network, but this is sort of like a pseudo high-level abstract weight matrix in some pseudo abstract bias vector. Again, so the whole thing will just be a single linear model, which again would be disappointing if that was the case. So this is the claim. This is the pseudo proof, or at least the reasoning. Think about if you have just two layers. So again, the second layer here is just a w sub 2 times h sub 1 plus b sub 2. H sub 1 itself is just w sub 1 times x plus b sub 1. So I can replace h sub 1 with its these two terms, which I do down here. And then you can just multiply w sub 2 throughout. So this multiplication of w sub 2 and the parenthetical becomes w sub 2 times w sub 1 times x plus w sub 2 times b sub 1 plus b sub 2. Okay? This is just another linear function, right? W sub 2 times w sub 1 is just going to be another matrix, which is pseudo like a weight matrix. It's not like it's going to be a linear transformation of x. There's no nonlinearities being introduced. There's no polynomials. There's no nonlinear function. And this little piece back here is going to be just another vector which we add to this this vector. Okay, so far h sub 2 is still linear in x. And you can just see, like you can just, I'm jumping a step here, but just like continue this line of reasoning all the way to the end of the alpha layer. And you can see you're just going to end up with a bunch of matrix multiplications times x plus, some matrix multiplications plus a vector. Everything will collapse into nothing more than a linear function and have gained nothing, okay? And this is the proof that if all you do is ablate, I guess, or remove the nonlinear function, if all you have is like, these hidden layers are just, absolutely the linear combination from the previous layer, then you're gonna not gonna have nonlinearities, you'll still have a linear model. So that's why nonlinear functions are so important. So let's think about a fully connected network. A fully connected network is just one in which every neuron from the previous layer is connected to every neuron in the current layer. So there's none of these possible connections are empty or zero, at least theoretically. So you'll have an input dimension d in. You'll have hidden layer sizes of all of these things. I keep on changing the variables here just to keep you on your toes a little bit. I considered changing these back to the d's like we had before, but I want you to make sure that you're not overfitting your mind to individual letters of the alphabet and you actually know what's going on. Anyway, you have input layer dimension, you have output layer dimension d sub out, and you have the layer sizes for every hidden layer. What that means is you have the total number of parameters, which is represented by this function. This follows the same kind of logic that we saw a moment ago, but this just basically tells us how many parameters we have to have. It's going to be the dot product here between d sub l and d sub l minus 1, plus the bias terms for that layer. And we just add this product for each of our L layers. And yeah, so this is the total number of parameters. We're going to see examples of this in a second. So here are the big examples. So let's see how neural networks will actually work with some nonlinearities. So the first thing we're going to do is compare our logistic regression baseline against a one hidden layer multi-layer perceptron. Multi-layer perceptron and feedforward neural network in this case are synonymous. They're the same thing. So the input is 10-dimensional. It's a binary classification, so the dimensionality of the output is going to be 1. And then imagine we have this hyperparameter where the hidden layer, the one hidden layer for the neural network, will have 20 neurons in it. So how many parameters do we need for logistic regression? Well, we're going to have 10 weights, one for each of the inputs. We're going to have one bias term. That's it. So that means that our logistic regression is going to have 11 parameters that we can update. How many parameters does the one hidden layer neural network need? Well, going from input to hidden, that's going to be 10 possible values times 20 connections in the hidden layer. So that's 10 times 20. But we also have this extra 20-dimensional bias term, which is here, which is like another row of the input matrix. So how many parameters do we have between the input and the hidden layers? That's 11 times 20, which is 220. You can check your math if you want on a calculator. And then subsequently, between the hidden layer and the output layer, well, there's 20 layers, 20 neurons rather, in the hidden layer. There's one bias, also in the hidden layer. And there's only going to be one output in the output layer, so it's just 20 plus 1 times 1, which is 21. And you just add the total number of parameters we have in our neural network, and that gives us 241 parameters. So 241 is like an order of magnitude more than logistic regression. It's more than 20 times as much. So we'll see if that's going to be a problem or not. We know that if we had too many parameters, like with a good old-fashioned regression, you could make a model as simple as possible, but no simpler, and that would avoid problems of overfitting. So already, given what we've learned in previous modules, like we have this kind of expectation that this hidden one hidden layer neural network might overfit, but we will see. So we can make a couple of changes. So we can change the width, which is the number of units per layer. There's this several findings, all linked over here, that suggest that the more parameters you have, the more width you have, the more expressive the function can be. You'll learn more if at each of those layers, that might be learning some different levels of architectural detail or hierarchical detail. You have richer functions, wider functions. More parameters to learn means you can learn more complicated things. More width implies more expressive functions. And there's other papers over here, again going back to classical times, suggest that if it's very wide, then even shallow networks with network with very few hidden layers can still approximate many functions. Depth is where a lot of the action seemed to progress. We call them deep neural networks, not wide neural networks, not wide learning. Deep learning seemed to be the thing to do. And indeed, there's some papers here from, again, somewhat classical times, where depth encourages hierarchical representations. So in that kind of like example I made with a face recognizer that represents different layers of the vision stack, depth will encourage representations at different hierarchical layers or representations. And these other papers suggested that the deeper neural networks can also be more parameter efficient for complicated structure. What that means is, if you want to learn something that can approximate many functions, like we know that wide networks can, it's more parameter efficient to represent those functions in terms of more layers, not more neurons per layer. This is all a bit loose and quick because, again, this is just a course, but you can read the papers and you can do experiments yourself to confirm or contradict what I just said. So the practical takeaway for this course, and as you sort of get into training neural networks, is it's often, especially for toy data sets, better to start small. So start with 1 or 2 hidden layers, unless you're already jumping into the deep end with tons of data and very deep neural networks, which we'll see in future modules. And then you will use the data set size, you will use validation performance, you will do cross-hole validation and all those other good things in order to try to increase or decrease the complexity. Again, if the number of hidden layers you have is a hyperparameter and the number of neurons per layer is a hyperparameter, then you can optimize those hyperparameters under the same general framework that we updated hyperparameters in other training paradigms. Let's see some quick examples. So the first example is back to moons. Again, I thought of not going back to moons again, but I wanted to just have some continuity so you can see how things are progressing. So again, there's 2-dimensional features, and there's binary labels. Here the binary labels can be thought of as purple and yellow, or 0 and 1. And if you want to get really good performance here, you're going to want to have a nonlinear boundary, obviously, right? So like this kind of like these 2 moons are kind of eating each other, and you want to carve out a space that kind of follows the nonlinear boundary between them. So nothing much is happening here, but for your own experimentation, this is just making the moons and plotting them. So we can go back to our logistic regression. We've seen this several times already, so I don't need to get into it too much. Again, I'm not using pipelines here, so naughty, but this is for illustration only, really. We have a logistic regression, we have a train test split, and we have a visualization, and we have like accuracy shown here on where are we? On train and test, as it was indicated there already. Anyway, so we have our training performance, we have our testing performance, and not great really, right? So we get up to about 84.7% accuracy on the test set, and the decision boundary is visualized here. There's yellow clearly to the lower right, purple clearly to the upper left, but there's this kind of very vague region between them that is very hard to predict accurately. This is a linear, as you can tell. There's a straight line hyperplane that goes through this space, and that could be why we get such bad representation. This is too simple, and therefore we can characterize this as an underfitting. Let's use a one hidden layer neural network. So let's go back to sklearn. There's a library called neural network, and there's a function called MLP classifier. We're going to use a multi-layer perceptron or a feedforward neural network for classification. How many hidden layers do we have, and how many neurons per hidden layer? That's specified by this argument. Hidden layer sizes. You can pass many parameters in here. We'll see another example in a moment. Here there's only a single hidden layer, so there's only one number I pass, and the number of neurons in this hidden layer is 20. The activation is going to be the ReLU function we saw earlier. The solver is going to be Atom. And then it just, because this is we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, barely, but this is an iterative process to learn this neural network through many iterations. We're going to do no more than 500, and we have a random state just to keep things reproducible. But otherwise, being sklearn, we'll use the good old-fashioned fit function on the exact same training data that we just used with logistic regression. We'll make our predictions on training, which is useful mostly just as a sanity check, and on our test set. And then we'll report our our accuracies, and then we'll do a little bit of visualization down here. So did we improve things? A little bit. So training accuracy went from 86% to 87.4%, and testing accuracy went from 84.7% to 87.3%. So, I mean, a difference of approximately 3% is might seem small, but like we mentioned several modules ago, if you scale things up, this can still be a big difference. And historically, these differences of 3-4% were deemed to be huge improvements. You can also see that we're kind of starting to get some nonlinearities. So instead of just being a straight line through the space, we have somewhat of a curved space over here between the purple moon and the yellow moon. But you know, it's not that much better than linear, apparently. It's nonlinear, sure, but it doesn't really hug the boundary between these two classes. And that simplicity might be why the test isn't doing so well. We might still be underfitting to some extent. So let's make things more complicated. Everything is the exact same here as I mentioned a moment ago. The only difference is that I'm going to use 2 hidden layers. The first hidden layer is going to have 20 neurons in it, and the second one's going to have 20 neurons in it. So you can take this code, put it into a Jupyter notebook, and play around to your heart's content with different values here. But with these values, like luckily, accidentally, we got a training accuracy jump from 87.4, I think we're going to see it all, 87.4 to 96.6, and testing accuracy went from 87.3 all the way up to 92%. So we're doing a really good job now. Like that's a pretty big jump just from simply adding a new layer in the neural network. This is pretty flexible, right? Like if you're using logistic regression, there's not too much you could really tune apart from the parameters. Whereas with neural networks, I could just I could swap, one nonlinear function as an activation function for another, change G to another G. And like I did right now, I could change the number of neurons in every layer and change the layers in the neural network to my heart's content until I find something that is decent on my validation set. And indeed, like just visually, this is a lot closer to what I was kind of aiming for. Like this decision boundary you can see between the purple and yellow regions it's not perfect, but it does kind of hug the region like pretty well. And you can see it really does a good job of separating things out in a nonlinear fashion. So things seem to be working out pretty well. There are some questions to ask. So this is for you to actually ask yourself and write down. Like I still encourage you to take notes and just try to think for yourself before we might see the answers to some of these questions. When does the neural network or the multi-layer perceptron boundary curve around the moons? That can be obvious. When are we using too few, enough, or too many hidden units across our various our 2 examples from before? And if you kept on doing your own experiments, do you have a better idea of when you have too few, enough, or too many hidden units? On the topic of generalization, like when is test accuracy similar to training accuracy? And can you fiddle with the numbers a little bit so that the training accuracy is way higher than the test accuracy? If that's the case, is that overfitting or is it some other phenomenon? And yeah, just play around with the number of hidden units per layer, the number of hidden layers. If you can, try to change the activation function and then just remark to yourself what kind of changes you're observing. That's example 1. Example 2 is this. This is the 2 moons is a fictional synthetic data set. The handwritten data set, handwritten digits data set is real data from real humans writing digits. So every example was like an 8x8 sort of grid of pixels, or pixels as some people call them. These are 64 pixel intensities in which we're trying to classify different digits. We've already seen digits in earlier modules, so in other modules we've seen this exact data set, so we know what we're going to deal with. And we're going to, again, compare logistic regression as a baseline to feedforward neural network, otherwise known as a multi-layer perceptron on this data set, and then play with capacity a little bit to see if it affects performance. So here I'm just loading the data. The data are available in sklearn. And here's some examples of handwritten digits. Kind of hard to see, even you may have to squint to really tell what some of these numbers are supposed to be, but it's realistic, tiny little data set. So here we just split up our data like we always do into training, validation, and test. Now let's do the proper thing with logistic regression. We'll again import logistic regression. Now we're going to use a pipeline. So then we're doing something a bit more careful here. We're going to do a standard scalar, and then we're going to do a logistic regression. And it's going to be multinomial. So this is just telling logistic regression. I mean, this is a bit of a detail that we didn't really get into too much depth theoretically, but you can force a logistic regression to produce more than just a binary output. You can make it produce one of k possible classes. All of this is in a pipeline now, so it's a bit safer. We'll fit, we'll predict, and then we'll report train, validation, and test performance for this logistic regression with not much other optimizations or fine-tuning going on. And we get like almost perfect training accuracy, excellent validation accuracy of 97.2%, and very good test accuracy of about 96.7%. Let's go to the one hidden layer MLP pipeline. So again, we're using a pipeline because we're being careful here. In this case, we're again using ReLU. We're going to use L2 regularization. We're going to see a little bit later how you can actually use L2 regularization in neural networks, but everything we mentioned previously with regards to regularization applies to neural networks as well, at least fundamentally. We're only going to do 500 iterations. We're going to have one hidden layer, and the hidden layer is going to have 64 units in it. And then apart from this, given this pipeline, everything else is essentially the same as for logistic regression, and we're just going to report our performance. We get perfect performance on training. We get slight degradation on validation performance. But again, validation set is really just there to tell us, when to stop learning, and it's helpful for us to optimize our hyperparameters. And our test accuracy is exactly what we got before with logistic regression. Let's try again with a two hidden layer MLP pipeline. So again, the only change is this argument list I'm applying to MLP classifier. Instead of having one value for one hidden layer, and I have two, both of these are going to have 64 units in them. I still have a perfect training accuracy. Validation accuracy is now somewhat between logistic regression and one hidden layer MLP, but the test accuracy goes up from 96.7 all the way up to 97.5. So not much interesting happening here really. If you're looking at things from the more complicated models back here, except there's an interesting aspect here, which is that the validation accuracy is actually a bit smaller than the test accuracy. This sometimes is not the case, just because the validation is something that we can optimize, so we can make validation accuracy as high as we kind of are able to, and then the result is that it normally, in my experience anyway, is higher than test accuracy, but we're not really doing any optimization on the hyperparameters here. So if you fiddled with the hyperparameters in this pipeline, maybe you'd be able to get a validation accuracy that's a bit higher. Regardless, this is our overall performance, just summarized using this data frame. So here's some important questions to ask yourself. Okay, so how many parameters? Like, what did increasing the number of parameters get us? So for digits, the input dimension was 64, and we had 10 possible classes. And then we know from several slides ago how to compute the total number of parameters we have. We just keep on multiplying the if everything's fully connected, which it is, every matrix in the neural network is going to be the number of hidden units or number of units in the previous layer plus 1 for bias times the total number of units in the current layer, which is shown over here. And then we can use that knowledge to just compute our total number of parameters. For logistic regression, again, we're not dealing with anything very fancy. We have 64 inputs, we have a bias term, we have 10 possible outputs, so everything is 650. I'm not going to go through the steps, but I would encourage you to just make sure that my calculations are correct. If they're not correct at any point, you're welcome to yourself to some bonus participation marks for pointing it out to me. But again, this ought to be correct. Having even a single one hidden layer neural network jumps to almost 5,000 parameters, and then adding a second hidden layer jumps to almost exactly 9,000 parameters. So look again at our validation and test accuracies and ask yourself, is the gain, if any, at all, between simpler models and our neural network models worth either 7 times more parameters or 14 times more parameters Like, is it worth it, right? We did 14 times more work in some sense, speaking very loosely, in this most complicated model than with this most simple model in this experiment, okay? And we've only achieved, a bit less than 1% improvement on our test set, okay? And in some sense, of course, a model could behave better on a test set. So when would you choose that? When would you choose the extra work in order to get only a small bump in performance? I'll leave it here as, again, for you to think about a little bit. But when you're thinking about these questions, don't forget to think a little bit about, again, the overfitting versus underfitting conversation. Let's talk briefly about evaluation and quality checks. So when using feedforward neural networks, you always, again, like every other model, you have to think about the overall decision context. So what is the task? Are you doing classification or regression? And what metrics matters? Is overall accuracy enough, or do you care about individual classes? Maybe the classes are not equivalent in size. Maybe you need to do calibration. Maybe different types of errors carry different real-world costs. So again, keep on asking those kinds of questions. For moons, accuracy is fine. This is like a visual synthetic data set, and it's a toy data set, so it's useful just to play around with. So there's not much of an ethical concern. There's not much that responsible AI might have to say about the 2 moons data set. But even with the digits data set, we start thinking a little bit about how this could be used, right? So normally accuracy is going to work. All of these digits should be more or less have equal proportions in the data set. But maybe if you look at the confusion matrix, because you're doing classification of amongst 10 possibilities, maybe looking at that confusion matrix will tell you, okay, this digit is often misrepresented as that digit. For many situations, like just doing simple experiments on your own or in a class like this, it's still kind of a toy data set. It's still very small, but you can quickly see how a model like this one could potentially be used in a post office to look at good old-fashioned mail and to sort them, to be used on cameras looking at a street view of a mapping application to try to identify houses, given the numbers that are on the side of houses. And you can off the top of your head, think of half a dozen other uses of a digit recognition neural network. So it might matter in that case if you're sending mail to the wrong location or misidentifying locations in the first place. There's real-world consequences to those kinds of deployments. Here's just a confusion matrix for our earlier examples. Again, we were doing quite well, so most of the action is on the diagonal. So again, the confusion matrix is just the number of counts comparing true labels to predicted labels. So there's 35 instances of actual zeros, which are predicted as zeros. There's one over here instance of an actual 0 being mislabeled as a 2, and so on. So again, almost everything is 0, and almost all of the action is on the diagonal because most of our predictions are correct. But already you can see a small amount of activity off of the diagonal. So down here, there's 3 8s that are misrepresented or misrecognized as a 1. So like, what's going on there? Is that worth some more consideration? You might want to look for systematic confusions. Maybe you expected 3s and 5s or 5s and 6s to be confused with one another. That doesn't seem to be the case here, but if you ran many experiments, maybe you'd observe different kinds of patterns off of the diagonal. And then, doing something like this might help to identify if there's any major problems. Like if a neural network just simply can't identify the number 8, then you want to be able to identify that using a visualization like this one. This is just for your own perusal right now, but I'd highly recommend it. We're going to stick to scikit-learn quite a bit in this course because of how well, I'm not saying PyTorch is not stable, but scikit-learn is very robust, and it's like a nice default way to get into a wide variety of topics in machine learning. And there's links here that basically point you towards neural network classifiers, regressors. There's some detail in those links, but basically here's just a list of things you can change. You can change the architecture, you can change the solver, you can decide whether you're using regularization or not. And there's some practical examples here where I'm just linking you to, so I encourage you to click these links and learn more. But I also wanted to mention PyTorch. PyTorch, we're going to see maybe a bit more of it in future modules, is more of the common library used in neural network research. It has lots of good hooks for taking advantage of GPUs and kind of drastically speeding up training and evaluation. And there's a lot of functions over here, which is kind of a preview of potentially future examples in this course. Learn about torch neural network modules, whether you're doing sequential, linear, what dropout is. Again, I hinted at what dropout is before, and we'll come back to that a bit later. There's all kinds of different losses you can use. So we basically saw a classification loss in supervised training, but in deep neural networks, you're more likely to see cross-entropy loss if you're doing kind of predictive, generative tasks. Mean squared error loss, like we saw before with regression, is going to be common. You also have solvers, so you still have stochastic gradient descent, atom, some other varieties here. And again, I just encourage you to click on all of these links and just poke around and see what you come up with. As always, risks, like everything we're talking about, carries risks and ethics in the real world. Even these simple neural networks can be used in high-stakes settings. Like I mentioned a few relatively high-stakes settings, like the post. The post is highly important, so is finance, health, hiring, or admitting students into university or grad school. So similar problems still exist. Overfitting might be a problem if you have neural networks with, like, as we've seen, relatively orders of magnitude more parameters than simpler models. Then does that mean overfitting is going to be a problem? How do I identify that? Neural networks can potentially be harder to interpret than simpler models, right? So this, like a simple logistic regression that basically carves out a space and says class zeros on that side, class ones on that side, is somewhat relatively easy to interpret if you know what the input variables are. But if we're pushing functions through all these nonlinear transformations, one after the other, and each of these layers represents something different, which is a latent space variable that I don't necessarily have access to. Like, how do I know what the neural network is actually doing? There are lots of solutions to this, some of which are partially useful, and we'll come back to that later in this course. Bias and fairness is still important. If your training data has biases in them, these neural networks, especially because of how efficient some of them are, can happily amplify those biases. And then robustness. So again, you're going to play around with the hyperparameters you can, including also the, I took it as granted that the random seed is always 3151, but play around with the random seed also to see if you can cause surprisingly varied models. Here's your quick check. It's online on the slides. So feedforward neural networks are compositions of linear transformations with nonlinear functions. Without these nonlinear activations, like tanh, sigmoid, ReLU, then all of these stacked layers are essentially just going to boil down to a single linear model, and we've gained nothing. So to learn nonlinear functions, even with however many layers you want, you're still going to have nonlinear transformations, the function g. The capacity of the model is just, again, changing the number of parameters you have in the model, and we do that by changing the depth, i.e. adding more layers or removing layers, or adding more width or removing width by adding or removing units per layer. And you can still do regularization or other forms of optimization. So that's going to control how much you can learn. Small feedforward neural networks can already learn nonlinear patterns like the moons. It can compete with linear models on real data. So we're doing a good job. If we take ourselves back to the early 2010s, neural networks don't necessarily seem at this point much better than logistic regression or support vector machines, but things will soon change as we go into deeper and deeper modules. So we're going to see backpropagation pretty soon, and we're going to get deeper and deeper into neural network and its various challenges soon enough. Here are various references. We're starting to get into some foundational papers in deep learning, so I encourage you to read these papers. As always, thanks so much. See you next time.